dean of the School of Environmental and the Yale School of Law. Then we have also Tanya, and then we have also...
And former U.S. government official for a number of years in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and a further set of years running Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I have, however, been a professor at Yale now for 25 years with a special focus on issues of sustainability and particularly of data-driven environmental policymaking. In addition to my role as a professor in the Environment School at Yale, I also teach in the Law School and the School of Management. And in that regard, I'm very much focused on the interdisciplinary issues that are really central to the sustainability challenges we're all focused on. I also am the director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy that for now 2 decades has been putting forward every other year the Environmental Performance Index, which you'll hear more about in just a few minutes. It has become one of the benchmark sustainability data efforts, providing a scorecard of country scale performance on 30-something different elements, measuring different aspects of the sustainability challenge, and tracking now performance both in an absolute sense and in terms of change, who's rising, who's falling on these critical issues. So welcome to all of you to our program today on achieving sustainability through metrics. It's a special joy at Yale to be co-hosting this event with UNITAR, and I want to thank at the outset Ambassador Marco Suazo and his team in New York of UNITAR experts. Also want to thank the team at Yale that's been working on this program, Tyler Yergain and Becky McLean in particular. I want to set the scene for just a few minutes about what we're going to dig into today, and then I will hand the virtual microphone to Mr. Nikhil Seth, who will do a welcome on behalf of UNITAR. So the story that we're digging into today is really the intersection of 2 of the overarching trends in the policy arena over the last 30 or 40 years. Trend number 1 is the important role that sustainable development now plays in structuring policy thinking at the national level, at the global level, and increasingly at the subnational and even the city scale. So the idea that we should be aiming for a sustainable future has really gained enormous traction in the years since the 1987 Brundtland Report really brought the idea of sustainable development to the fore. Of course, that focus on sustainable development and sustainability more broadly was consolidated in important ways at the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, better known as the Rio Earth Summit. It's been regularly reiterated as a critical framework in the intervening years, including at the Rio +20 event. That was perhaps the second time that this issue was really put front and center in a major way and helped structure thinking for the world community. The second trend that intersects with this emphasis on sustainability is the idea that we should make our environmental efforts and related energy efforts, sustainability efforts more broadly, more data-driven, more quantitative, more empirical, more fact-based. And you're going to hear today about how that effort is unfolded, the kind of metrics and indicators that have been developed, how they allow us to track critical trends, trends in environmental results, the quality of the air, the buildup of greenhouse gases, water quality, and a whole range of other critical sustainability issues. It allows us not only to track the on-the-ground progress or in-the-air progress, but also to track policy success, to understand what programs are working, what are not. And in a world of limited resources, that turns out to be absolutely essential information, as governments, again, at every scale, local scale, regional scale, national scale, global scale, are eager to ensure that their limited funds are doing the most good that they can do. So we want to know what's working to put more resources behind those efforts, and where things are not working, pull back the resources and redirect them. And a metrics-based approach, as you're going to hear, allows us to get a gauge of who the leaders are, who the laggards are, and frankly, what those best practices are that should be more widely disseminated. So we have 2 panels today that are going to dig into these issues. The first looking at the Environmental Performance Index, something, as I mentioned, that's been now out in the marketplace, out in the world of thinking about sustainability for a couple of decades. It's put together every other year by a team from Yale University and our colleagues at Columbia University. And we've got 2 of the folks who've been actively involved in that effort, going back over the full scope of that couple of decades to review the kind of history of sustainability metrics and how these metrics have evolved and developed and emerged now in full form, perhaps, in the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. In our second panel, we really dig into that convergence into the Sustainable Development Goals, two people actively involved in tracking and originally developing these goals will present, John MacArthur and Guillaume Lafortune from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So we're very excited about having a chance to dig in to sustainability broadly, the data-driven element of it in particular, and the Environmental Performance Index as one of the original foundations for data-driven sustainability, and now the 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 quantitative targets. So this does give us a chance to look hard at the issues that so many of you are concerned about and that we know we need to measure and gauge progress on and guide governments in terms of their efforts. And so with that, let me turn the virtual microphone over to the UN Assistant Secretary General and the Executive Director of the UN Institute for Training and Research, Nikhil Seth, who's been at this business for a very long time in a number of roles in the UN and has now for a number of years been leading UNITAR and really bringing this kind of program to an ever wider audience and ensuring that we all are thinking together about the best practices and pathways to progress towards a sustainable future. Mr. Seth.
Professor Don Esti and your wonderful team at Yale, Marco Suazo and my wonderful team in New York. The forthcoming panelists are all very eminent and who've done a lot of work in this area. All you wonderful participants all around the world, a big hello from Geneva, where I'm currently based. Thank you for helping in the organization, for all those who've helped in the organization. And thank you for those who are joining us today virtually and safely for this UNITAR and Yale University workshop on achieving sustainability through metrics. One of the many things that have been driven home in 2020 is the importance of data in driving intelligent policy. We have unfortunately also been exposed to data manipulation and the use of data as a political tool. But we need to get data into policy right. And we must eschew misinformation and strengthen scientific evidence in everything, all the problems that our contemporary world is facing. UNITAR, as you may know, is dedicated to developing capacities and enhancing the quality of global decision-making processes and supporting country-level actions for our better future. Capacity building on data across the SDGs and in the types of things Professor Dan Esti talked about is at the heart of our mission. As you all know, the goals, target, and indicator structure that we developed for the SDGs had the full engagement of the UN Statistical Commission. It's a commission which brings together the statistical officers from all around the world. Monitoring and reviewing progress is crucially dependent on building associated statistical capacities, particularly in the developing countries. Though the SDGs were adopted in 2015, they represent the world's commitment to a sustainable future. The measurement dimension has always been a challenge, especially for poorer countries, to see what kind of a trajectory are we on. It's nice and easy to have a beautiful form of words to express our collective intent, but it's very difficult to be able to monitor, to be able to review and take the right course corrections on which progress is dependent. Now, UNITAR is honored to present this workshop along with the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. And as Professor Dan has just indicated, you'll go into the history of the development of these metrics, as also the Sustainable Development Goals, the metrics in practice by the SDSN and by the Brookings Institution. I was at the heart of some of this history, starting from the Earth Summit, which Professor Dan mentioned in 1992 when I was a delegate to that conference. And through the processes, the Millennium Development Goals, the Rio +20 outcome, and the SDGs, and I know how difficult some of these issues are. And I hope that by learning what we are going to be learning in this kind of seminar stroke session is what we need. The Environmental Performance Index looks at the environmental sustainability dimensions. The SDGs are much broader, they are interdisciplinary, and they include the economic, social, and sometimes the more complicated issues of the creation of peaceful and just societies. Through this information session, we can effectively bridge the gap between environmental policies and sustainability matrix and provide helpful information for participants to better understand the importance of data and analytics. The experts who will be talking to you today on the EPI and the SDGs will share their own experiences in insights in working on these metrics. One thing I just wanted to mention before passing the floor is that in UNITAR, we've been working a lot with GIS, the Global Information Systems, and satellite imagery analysis. Sometimes these aren't given enough appreciation, but I am deeply convinced of the power of such analysis, not only in the environmental domain, but also in the humanitarian, the peace and security, and many other fields. As you all know, satellites are circulating our little planet and have daily images of the same spot over several decades. And these analyzed images, when given to policymakers, are worth thousands of words of analysis. They are a powerful tool for policymakers. Things like coastal zone erosion, flood mapping, forest cover, fresh water, famine indicators, the destruction of our cultural heritage, the state of refugee camps, the humanitarian mapping, the human rights situations. The potential of satellite imagery analysis is limitless. And I just wanted to urge all of you not to ignore this very powerful source of empirical data. It is our great pleasure today to have experts from Yale University, the Hickson Center for Sustainable Environmental Design, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and Brookings Institutions, who will share with us their knowledge. I wish you an engaging and informative meeting. And with these words, I pass the floor on to Dr. Zach, who will conduct the rest of this meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seth. We're very happy to have you all here today to talk about sustainability metrics. This was organized in collaboration with UNITAR and the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, especially with the invitation of Ambassador Suazo. Ambassador Suazo, would you like to make a few remarks about the importance and impact of this seminar? I believe you're on mute.
We are still learning how to use these new technologies. Thank you very much to the Executive Director of UNITAR, to our dear friend Dan Etzi from Yale University. For us, it's a real pleasure to join today in this event. I have to confess, I'm going to use this session for educate myself. I am not an expert in biometrics or in measuring. I know the importance he has on our daily life. Today, biometrics is one of the most important tools that we are using in order to try to combat this terrible pandemic that is crushing us all around the planet. So being able to use metrics, all type of metrics in our daily work helps and facilitate decision-making process, like Mr. Seth just said. And also it's important to keep the records that allow us to measure results and therefore take corrective actions. There is an old phrase that says that we can only improve what we can measure. So this is well known. So that's why the metrics are so important. the statistical data, the functionality of metrics is vast and extensive. So I guess this make this event today more relevant than ever, as I said, due to conditions in which we are living. So I hope this workshop today will help to promote and expand the use of metrics to measure sustainability. I am very happy to see the whole set of panelists that Dan and Yale University managed to put us together. And for us, it's a continuing work together with Yale and UNITAR. And I am very pleased that Mr. Seth have a time to share his time with us today. So I don't want to lose more time of the distinguished panelists, Zach, and I will yield to you. And thank you very much to all the teams that has made this possible. And for all the participants, I hope you enjoy this event today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So just to start us off, I'll go over a brief overview of what we're trying to do today. As you can see, we're going to have two panels starting in just a few minutes. First, we'll talk about the Environmental Performance Index and the history and development of sustainability indicators. Because this is a rather long panel, we'll have a break before we move into our second half of the program, where we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and how to put metrics into practice. And then we'll end probably by 12:30 or so with some closing remarks. Just as a reminder, the objectives for this event are to help the participants to understand the value of sustainability metrics as a guide to environmental policy evaluation and performance assessment, as well as to be familiar with metrics related to the SDGs and the EPI, and also to be able to communicate with government officials, business leaders, and practitioners on sustainability metrics and data, environmental performance, and environmental data and analytics. By the end of the session, participants should be well-versed in the fundamentals of metrics, be comfortable with the concepts and language, and also know how to stay current on the latest developments of sustainability metrics. And with that, we'll go ahead and begin panel one. I want to thank again Ambassador Suazo, Professor Este, and Mr. Seth for joining us for opening remarks and for kicking us off. So to begin, I think it might make sense for Tanya, if you'd like to give us a general overview of your work and the general concepts behind sustainability metrics.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you to all the organizers. In particular, I want to thank Professor Este, who was my PhD advisor. Let me share my screen. I have a couple of slides, and I will do my very best to stay within the time frame, although it is a topic that much can be said about. Let me start by saying that this meeting, I think, is very, very timely. COVID has shown us once more that having the right data at the right time, at the right resolution is very crucial for decision-making that can be costly, both in terms of lives impacted and economic costs. So sticking with the economic costs, Peter Drucker famously said, you can't manage what you don't measure. And that holds very true in the sustainability field as well. And just to show you how far we have come since Mr. Drucker said these words, and since the publication of the 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, the growth in indicators that began after the Brundtland Report was released was really showing the great interest and the great need for quantifying human interactions with the environment, human interactions with one another, and the role that economic activities play. And so over time, really that ecosystem of indicators has given rise to a much better understanding of causal relationships that play out in what we might want to call systems of interactions and cause and effects. And so I'm showing you here one such model, in fact, one that was developed by the EPA to show the intricate relationships that humans have with one another, with ecosystems, and the stressors that work on both and that need to be managed sustainably. In parallel, really, with our efforts to develop meaningful indicators of human environment and human society interactions, there has been an exponential, really unparalleled growth in our data collection and data storage abilities. And I'm showing you here a picture of a system now that is best described as a system of systems. And in fact, it calls itself the GEOS, the Global Earth Observation System of Systems, which literally integrates and makes available to policy analysts, to scientists, to practitioners, terabytes of data every day. That said, that amount of data itself, right, is not necessarily immediately useful for those who need to make decisions about where to steer the economy, which ecosystem aspects to protect, what human interaction, what human cultural functions are important for a sustainable development path. So decision makers really need timely, accurate, and integrated indicators of the systems that they seek to influence and manage. So let me take a look for a moment at the SDGs. The SDGs are a very comprehensive assembly of indicators capturing what are commonly understood to be the domains of sustainable development. From poverty to gender equality, to environmental quality and environmental conditions, to our economic system and how it relates to those aspects, clean and responsible consumption, renewable energy systems, and so forth. If we just zoom in for a moment to the indicators that capture environmental aspects in the SDGs, we see that there are many that do so. Life below water, climate action, life on land, sustainable cities and communities, and several more. But it doesn't take much in terms of unpacking the SDGs further to understand that the environment really interacts with all the SDGs. And this is what takes me back to the word assembly of indicators. So while the SDGs provide a very useful and very visually attractive dashboard of the state of our economy, of our society and in the environment for the purpose of sustainable development, policy making and tracking and monitoring, it doesn't necessarily show the underlying causal pathways that connect the NDGs with one another. So if we were a pilot flying the Sustainable Development Plane, we might not have all of the information needed to steer that plane efficiently and safely, and to apply our attention, or in other words, our scarce resources such as time, money, and capacity for the most efficient impact across the SDG domains. So we need to keep that in mind as policymakers, that there are different types of indicator systems, and that each of them has its own strength, but also limitations. I have attempted here to show you some of these main types of indicator systems. On the one hand, we have dashboards like the SDGs, which are very useful for tracking a wide variety of sustainability aspects in an attractive, easy to glance system, but we don't have the same granularity and the same level of understanding when it comes to the underlying cause-effect pathways. Composite indicators, on the other hand, like the EPI and the SDG index and others like GDP, are built to capture some of these relationships through the aggregation function that brings different indicators together into the composite index, and the weighting scheme that is used therein. The index can signal what are the existing associations and what are the relative importances of the constituent indicators. Another type of system is present, we are familiar with our accounting systems. Originally developed around economic goals. So I just want to mention the system of national accounts here, but then later extended into the environmental domain and into the social domain as well. Most notably on the environmental front is the SEEA, the System of Integrated Economic and Environmental Accounting, and also the Natural Capital Accounting Project. Accounting systems have the advantage that they're built on a methodological system of checks and balances, where flows and stocks need to add up across a particular geographic region for a resource that we are interested in. We can link such accounting system both through monetary and physical units, which was one of the particular areas of focus for the SEEA, as it was built as a system of modules that ties to the system of natural accounts, which is tracked both in monetary and physical units, and then expands from there to the monetary valuation of natural capital, as is done in the Natural Capital Accounting Project. And finally, I would argue that one of the most advanced ways to capture human environment, human economy, and human society interactions is through models. Models need to make functional relationships, causal pathways, explicit in their setup. So from climate change models to watershed models to now COVID spread models, those functional relationships are built into the system and allow us to not only take a snapshot of the state of the system at present, but also to make predictions into the future and to use it for scenario planning. The what might be happening is as a feature of these models. So where then do we go from collecting more and more data on the one hand to really needing to integrate all that data in order to facilitate meaningful and effective and efficient decision making? So that's really the pathway that links data via information and knowledge gathering to gaining insight and ultimately wisdom. And I've tried to map the indicator systems that I talked about a little bit onto this pathway. So I think, for example, that systems like the SDGs and the EPI and SEA are really providing a great deal of new knowledge and insight. But if they were linked also to a parameterized modeling framework, we could, I think, edge out an even further step towards making predictions, towards gathering the kind of wisdom that policymakers need for their day-to-day work. So in summary, when it comes to deciding what type of indicators and what type of indicator system might be useful for your area of work, for your domain, and for your a task at hand, it is helpful to start by specifying what the concrete needs and objectives are that you are trying to accomplish. And then to seek a framework or methodological approach towards selecting indicator systems that is suited for meeting those needs and objectives. One thing I would emphasize is that it is helpful to keep in mind potential future cross-integration of the indicator system that you choose with that of other policy domains. Especially in the sustainability realm, we know that sustainable decision-making or sustainability is a truly inter- and transdisciplinary effort. So integrating indicator systems with one another, both on the data management and storage front, but also when it comes to the interpretation of indicators, the trends that they show, the spatial and temporal resolution that they have, thinking already ahead about integrating them with other policy domains is a useful thing to do. I cannot overemphasize really the need to invest the time and money it takes into adequate data collection, processing, and validation efforts. It really is sort of the 80-20 rule. If 80% of your attention early on is focused on identifying the right indicators, the right framework, and strong data collection and processing efforts, your efforts to extract knowledge, information, and wisdom from them will just take 20% of your time and effort down the road. And consider building really the structures within your policy domain that facilitate your use of the indicators. Think about how that indicator system will inform your decision-making at every step, and invest in the data visualization and the data sharing and data monitoring and tracking efforts that will make that policy integration so much more seamless and therefore facilitate the use of the indicators. After all, if you put 80% of your time and money into designing them, but then end up not using them, would be a wasted effort. So I will conclude here just by saying that I think the indicator community and our ecosystem of indicators has really come a long, long way since 1987. And it is fascinating to see every day new papers published, new policy analysis being released that make use of everything from satellite data to citizen science collected data to, of course, our national statistical systems that continue to play such a vital role in providing a timely, accurate information about the national economy, environment, and society. So it's a wonderful path, I think, to join at this time. The field has matured quite a bit. With that, I conclude and hand the mic back to Zach. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you so much, Tanya. That was very enlightening, especially this background knowledge that it's important to develop about the background and the uses and how sustainability indicators come in different varieties and have different applications, and you have to be very clear about what the intention is behind achieving sustainability when you're trying to design these systems. So as an example of what Tanya just helped us to conceive of on a broader picture, we'll drill down a little bit more and look at the Environmental Performance Index. All right, let me. As Ambassador Suazo said, we're all learning this. Okay. So the Environmental Performance Index, I have been the principal investigator behind this project for 2018 and 2020. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the Yale Center for Environmental Policy. And this is a project done jointly here at Yale University And also with our collaborators at Columbia University, the Earth Institute has a Center for International Earth Science and Information Network. And we're currently supported by the generous help of the McCall McBain Foundation. So the origin story really begins at the close of the 20th century. When we look at environmental policy across the world, there was a sense as the century wound down that environmental policy had been driven too much by anecdotes, sensational events, and the hunches of gurus who were trying to guide how environmental policy was proceeding. And as the environmental movement matured over perhaps less than half a century, it already began to show signs of diminishing marginal returns. And this in turn led to a backlash against policies that were perceived as being ineffective and costly. At the same time, we saw the rise in other domains, particularly in the private sector, more data-driven approaches that were yielding much greater returns. And there was a sense that we needed to connect environmental policy to the power that data was able to provide in other domains. So at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, we saw what was embodied in Agenda 21, this call for indicators of sustainable development. The ability to tap into the science that was happening, that was generating more and more data that could provide information that would be useful for policymakers and other stakeholders in order to give them some grounds for understanding what progress would look like. But even so, by 1995, we have this summary from the president of the World Resources Institute, who said there's no remotely similar number to GDP to indicate how the environment is faring. This led, a few years later, to the chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, to establish an environmental task force, whose goal was to develop something analogous to GDP, an indicator, a composite index, that was able to help us track progress in the environmental sphere. The following year, the pilot Environmental Sustainability Index was produced, and then subsequent editions of this in 2001, 2002, and 2005, building momentum towards understanding how the emerging science and indicators could be combined into a communications tool to drive policy. But by 2006, there was a major refocus. And this is when we see the emergence of the EPI. In 2006, we came out with the Pilot Environmental Performance Index, which I believe Tanya may have been the project director of. And there were three major shifts in the emergence of the EPI away from earlier efforts. The first was to redirect from sustainability broadly to focusing more on the environment. And this was done in response to what policymakers would do with this report. To understand that even though the science is expansive and messy and interconnected, government offices, policymakers, exist within a framework that you're going to have a ministry of the environment or an agency or some kind of bureau. And to be responsive to how policymakers conceive of this is important in order to influence how policy is made. The second is that the first reports really focus more on endowments. For example, how much water is there in your country? And these are things that are not amenable to having policy levers. Countries have very little control over how much rain falls into their borders. So there is a shift from thinking about endowments to thinking about performance. What are the things that could actually be changed by policy? And on that note, we also don't want to look at drivers and inputs. It's all very well if governments pass laws and regulations, propose rules, and sign on to international agreements to help guide environmental progress. But what we actually want to measure are the outcomes that are happening. And so there was a shift away from measuring such things as what are the intentions behind policymakers to what are they actually doing on the ground. And this is a very important shift in our thinking and really has led to our current understanding of how sustainability metrics can drive success. So the EPI is a composite index. This is where we take many different indicators, individual measurements of specific things about the environment, and we aggregate them in a hierarchical way. We can take similar indicators and group them together into issue categories, and then similar issue categories into policy objectives, and then finally getting an overall score So where dashboards, one of the types of indicator, collections of information that Tanya reviewed in the last presentation, can give you a broad overview of what's going on. It's also easy to get lost in that. And when you're dealing with people who have limited time and attention, really capturing people's focus requires distilling a broad set of information into one number that can really make a highest impact. So just as an illustration of what this can look like, we weight the different indicators in the outer ring, gathering them into 11 different issue categories, and then those into 2 broad policy objectives. And this is guided by 2 things. One is by what the science says, what kinds of things are interconnected in this way. The other thing here that's important is thinking about how government ministries are organized. There often might be multiple ministries, one dealing with environmental health and one more dealing with natural resources. And within those, you have different government offices as well. And so this is why we think it's important in order to, more broadly, organize these in ways that follow along traditional lines of thinking, even though the scientists would tell us, oh no, these are all much more complicated ways of interacting with each other. If you'd like to follow along with this, I know this is a lot to digest in a single slide. I've just added the link to the EPI where all of our information is online that you can explore on your own in greater depth. We try to value transparency and accessibility to the broadest audience possible. And really to understand fully what the EPI has to offer, it really yields great returns to explore this on your own. A couple of other things that I'll say. So what are some examples of indicators we might use? So we have 32 indicators in the 2020 EPI. And every 2 years, we come out with a new report where we add new indicators, drop old ones, and refine our ways of thinking about the environment. We have such things as exposure to PM 2.5, one of the most insidious air pollutants that has gotten much wider attention, especially in the last few years, as countries around the world have dealt with wildfires, which is a great source in addition to combustion of fossil fuels. We look at things like tree cover laws. What's the status of your fish stocks? How much of your terrestrial biomes are you protecting? And then also response to different greenhouse gases. For example, what is your CO2 emission growth rate? Now, every year people ask us why we included some indicators and not others. And to make truly international comparisons in a way that's rigorous and helpful, we have 8 different criteria about how we select our data. This means that some things that are important, and we know that are important, get left out of the EPI. It's a work in progress, but we're always trying to keep abreast of what the science has to offer and see if it matches with what we're interested in. Things like, are the indicators broadly applicable? Do they affect most countries? Are they measuring outcomes and not inputs to the policy process? Are they collected according to established methods that scientific community has approved or an international organization has validated? And most importantly, are they verified by a third party or collected by a third party? This is why we really don't like to rely on country-generated reports. We get inquiries from countries all the time who want to know if they can offer to us their own collected data that we can use in the report. And what we continually say is that that violates our data selection criteria. We really want a third party to say that these numbers are trustworthy. And it's not because we sincerely doubt that countries are making good efforts in order to produce information, but that outside verification helps to make sure that we aren't blind to our own weaknesses in our methods, and also gives people greater confidence that we're not making any kind of special exceptions for countries who might want to present the most favorable method of describing their conditions in their countries. So data sets that cover lots of countries that are not limited to a small subset of what the world is. If they're able to give us something that's temporally complete, time series is very powerful for understanding trends and how things are changing over time. And also data that have been collected most recently, and probably most importantly, things that are open source. If we went with proprietary data sets, that means that other people can't download the same data that we're looking at and can't verify and try to replicate our methods. So finding data sets that satisfy all of these data selection criteria is a difficult and challenging process. And we welcome any kinds of suggestions that you all might have for us about other data sets that we can include in our report in order to make sure that we're being most responsive to the widest available amount of information. So besides the main collaborators on this, we also work with a number of data partners. Some of them you see here. These are all trusted international organizations who are doing their best to develop scientifically rigorous and timely estimates of what the state of the world is. We're happy to work with them and give a broader spotlight to the great work that research teams all around the world are doing, and incorporate mention EPI as a way of giving greater currency to these types of information. Whereas you might have a narrow ability or a radar to define what kinds of scientific information is out there, the EPI as an umbrella helps to gather all of these different research groups that are doing great and important work and focusing it into a single place. So one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is our transparency. If you were to go to the EPI website, you'll see that we have for download all of the data we've collected, organized in a way that's easy for people to play around with on their own, run their own analyses on, as well as to retrace our steps and to find our data partners. You can find this in our technical appendix and also in our links where we provide, a portal where you can go and explore all of our partners and what they're doing. And this is really I think the cornerstone of why the EPI has been such a durable and important player in this space, is that we provide analytically rigorous assessments and compensation of scientific information in a way that's credible and useful, and that depends on our transparency. This is a work in progress. Like I said at the very beginning, we try to be something analogous to GDP, but we recognize that it took them decades in order to really refine what GDP is, and they're still making various tweaks to that formula. And so we're very open that we're not doing this perfectly. We're presenting one version of how to run this analysis. And we welcome all kinds of critiques, suggestions, feedback, inquiries about our methods, how we've done things, and how we can improve in the future. So right now we're gearing up for the 2022 EPI, and we hope that everyone today and your partners and greater contacts we're inviting you to help join us and to give us feedback and suggestions of what we can do to make this EPI report more useful to you. And part of that, I think, is us highlighting the data gaps that we have. And even if you don't have a direct suggestion for us, we would use this time to call upon the world to help support global data systems. And that is everything from collecting the data to establishing verification systems to gathering it in all in one place where it can be disseminated and used broadly. And this is important on a wide number of gaps that we are really struggling to fill, including on hazardous waste, water quality, water quantity. Agriculture is very hard to measure in a way that's broadly applicable across the world. Also spillover impacts, environmental impacts that are embedded in traded goods and services. There's a great need out there to give us a greater, more complete picture of how the world is doing. And I think every country has something they can do to contribute to that effort. So on that note, I think that is the EPI perspective on sustainability metrics and how composite indices are an important tool in driving success, and especially a communication tool of giving countries the opportunity to look further into scientific data that maybe otherwise would be obscured or not really prominent or salient in their space. So on that note, I think Tanya and I can spend some time for the rest of the panel fielding questions from the audience. If you guys have anything, just please drop it in the Q&A or the chat. And let's see if we have any questions right now. All right, we have a team behind the scenes who is looking into this. All right, 3 new messages. All right, Tanya, can you elaborate on the question? From Ahmed, who writes, actually, I do have ASCII analog data, temporal information, and definitely satellite data for my area of interest, but I don't have SDG indicators information at regional level. Are you aware of any regional SDG indicators in the case of Northern India?
I actually think that we might have members on our panel who can answer that question from the Sustainable Development Goal Network, because I have seen some regional or subnational efforts of SDG calculation and using them for policy processes in your 2020 report. So I'd be happy to pass that question on to maybe Guillaume or.
Sure. I was going to go through this in the next session that's really on the SDGs, but I can say a few words now. So I'm coordinating the annual Sustainable Development Report, which includes an SDG index and the dashboards. And as part of our work, we've been doing a lot of work to apply our methodology at the subnational level also. So we've been working with the United States. So we've done reports using state level data, but also municipal data as well. We published last July a report with Bolivia municipalities. We have reports also on Italy, Spain, European cities, with working with a number of Latin American countries also to localize the agenda. So we've been doing quite a large amount of work at the subnational level, leveraging the data that is disaggregated at this level. For India, I believe there is a report done by what is it, Niti Aayog. There is a report which is done by Niti Aayog. I believe it was done at least once. I don't know if it was repeated, which tracks the implementation of the SDGs, which provides a baseline assessment, I believe, at the level of regions in India. So we have commented on this report when it was at the draft stage, but we have not contributed to this assessment made by Niti Aayog, which is a separate organization. But I believe there is some information available to track the performance of Indian regions at subnational level.
All right, great. I also see some questions here about how do we weight things in the EPI. I will say that there is no one perfect way to weighting things, and we certainly have not hit upon it. Some of our weights are subjective, and some of them are more data-driven. So the ones in the environmental health category are based upon worldwide. Where do we see the greatest threats from, threats to human health, mortality, morbidity, the life years lost due to sickness and death? And that's a little bit more of an empirical approach. Other things are much more subjective. We know that biodiversity and climate change are the greatest threats to planetary boundaries. So those get greater weight proportionally based upon our best assessment of things. And then within greenhouse gases, we weight those based upon how much forcing has already happened in the atmosphere since about 1970. And so even though there are some gases that have greater global warming potential, fewer of those gases have been released. So it's a function not just of global warming potential, but also the volume or the mass that's been emitted since the last 50 years or so. So we try to make a balance between subjective and empirical approaches. Other things are more transparent, like simple equal weighting, or you could do even groovier things like factor analysis. But Our results tend to be robust to alternative weighting schemes that you might find sensible. I don't know, Sonia, in the early days of the EPI, did you guys run into any issues with this?
Weighting is always a question, right? Because it expresses, on the one hand, perhaps the what the science tells us about the relative importance of different indicators, but on the other hand, you can also argue that you might want to use as weights the policy priorities that a particular country might want to attach to different indicators. So if I were to just compare, the state of New York and the state of California, where I am, water would probably be weighted somewhat differently because of local context and therefore priorities. So weighting, I think, will continue to be an issue that is going to be discussed and debated, and there is no single right answer. One conversation that I also recall from the early days of the EPI, it was, we could have always applied a data-driven weighting scheme, such as one based on factor analysis. But then that weighting scheme would change year over year. And I think one of the key advantages of a composite index is that if repeated and published multiple times over time, it gives you information about trends. But if you continuously change the weighting, APIs over time won't be directly comparable. So I think we opted early on to choose the weights based on what we thought and what the science was telling us was the relative scientific importance. But I know that that understanding has evolved a little bit since then. But yes, it remains an issue in the design of composite indicators that continues to be debated.
Okay, we also have a question here about simulated scenarios, the EPI and models. I think this addresses the slide Tanya put up, where we look at the development of information across composite indices, gives insights, and then ultimately want to help that to drive into models. I will say that the EPI does not include models or simulations because of our focus on actual outcomes rather than things that are generated by a lot of assumptions into the unknown. So we would be reluctant, I think, to include simulations into the EPI, although we would be delighted if people used our framework, our results and analyses as an input to simulations to answer the questions that might be more relevant to policymakers. And if that kind of work is going on, we'd love to know about it, and to the extent that we can, and the narrative portion of our report to highlight that kind of synthesis of the work that we're producing with the work that other people are doing to help us understand how under different scenarios the environment can change. So please, if you know of any such work, please either email us or drop it into the chat now. Tanya, do you want to talk a little bit more about, or elaborate more, I guess, on the use of models to help us understand an integrated planning and assessment?
Yes, let me start by saying that I think models versus composite indicators versus dashboards, there is not like one approach that is uniformly better than all others. It really depends on what your particular needs and objectives are, as Zach pointed out. Models, because of their implicit sort of set of assumptions and the uncertainty surrounding future projections, might in some cases have carry more or prompt more questions from policymakers than a recent snapshot of actual measured conditions on the ground, like the EPI offers. So I think it comes down to deciding what might be the best option for your purpose. I think that models in in some contexts, such as climate change assessment and climate change predictions, have clearly, I think, like both started to dominate the discourse because they offer that forward-looking potential, and they also offer an increasing level of spatial and temporal granularity that provides people planning for climate change adaptation and mitigation a snapshot of what their region might look like, 20, 50, 100 years into the future. So I think there are realms in the sustainability debate where models have really proven their worth now and have gotten so much better over time, both with increased scientific understanding of the processes that drive physical, chemical, biological processes, but also our computing power, our sheer ability to run an integrated a model at 100 square kilometer resolution for the whole planet, so at a temporal resolution of every 30 minutes. I mean, that's just amazing. So I think there are, I welcome that progress, but again, the actual choice of indicator system or indicator approach that you choose is dependent on your specific needs, and it might be a dashboard, might be a composite indicator, might be a model.
Okay, we also have some questions about the parameters used in the EPI and how it's used for achieving sustainability. I could spend all 3 hours going through all of the parameters. I would encourage all participants to go to our website to look through the 30 different indicators. And if you really wanted to get super nerdy, you can go read our technical appendix where you can see exactly how the calculations are being used. But I think a more interesting question is how the EPI is used for achieving sustainability. I'd say there are probably a number of ways that we could answer this. One of the things I think is easiest to say is there are lots of ways people are using this that we don't know about, because we're pushing it out into the world, and then we hear later on, it's driving conversations and getting people's attention. The EPI is a communications tool. It's meant to capture people's attention in a way that maybe a dashboard would do for a different audience. But what we want people to do is to look at the EPI and to reflect on how their country compares to who they consider to be their peer group to be. There's no real way, I think, that Liberia, who is last in the 2020 EPI, is going to look at the report and think, oh no, we should be up there at the top near Denmark. But it is helpful for countries to look at their relative peer groups, however they conceive of that. It could be if you're a small island developing state, you look at the other small island developing states. It could be your regional neighbors, other countries who share your geography or level of economic development, and to think, who is doing worse or better than I am, and why is that so? So everyone has a top line score, and if you want to know that better, you can say, what's driving that? Is it my environmental health component, or is it my ecosystem vitality component? And then you can drill down even further to say, well, is it about my fisheries? And then within fisheries, what is going on there? So it's meant to be a beginning of a broader conversation that happens within countries, where we know that the media can pick up on the EPI and use that to hold policymakers accountable. It could be used within ministries to help focus their agendas. And on that note, we have had countries approach us and ask us to help them understand how the EPI is generated, and even to recast their environmental agendas. And so what we would consider to be the biggest win for our index is if we push policymakers to conceive of environmental policy more broadly in a data-driven approach, in order to start collecting more data, in order to tie those data, those outcomes, to the policymaking process, and to increase the amount of transparency and accountability they have to a broader set of stakeholders for public input. And so that is, the ways that we have both formally and informally influenced the policy process and driven countries to pursue sustainability in a way that's more analytically rigorous and therefore more successful. I've been with the project for 4 years now. So I see one slice of this 20-year project. Tanya, do you have any recollections of how countries have used the EPI?
Oh, I think I recall that one year that one of the Nordic countries called up Professor Esti and asked what could be done so that they are back on top of the ranking, because we traditionally find Scandinavian and Nordic countries ranking very highly. I don't know if it was Finland, Prof. Esti. I think another one was,
Tanya, was Norway
oh,
that had come in second place behind Finland. And, the prime minister asked for a briefing on what was going on. And I thought he would declare success and run out the door and have a press conference and say, Norway's a great place. This was, of course, being done at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And he would call, everyone together and say, Norway's so proud. Instead of a 15-minute quick sort of drive-by discussion, he insisted his staff change the schedule. He spent nearly an hour with me, quizzing me line by line on what Norway would need to do to overtake Finland to be number one. And it demonstrated to me at the time, and something we've ever after followed, the importance of peer comparisons. Because what we learned at that moment was that Norway didn't think of itself as number 2 out of 180 countries. It thought of itself as number 2 out of 4 countries, looking at the peer group being just Scandinavia. And that's why we put so much emphasis in trying to do our environmental performance index as a scorecard that is not just 1 to 180 countries, the number we now have in the index, but frankly, much more emphasis on grouping people against the relevant peer cluster that they would find themselves appropriately benchmarked against. So that's in some cases regional groups, it's some cases trade groups, it's in some cases countries that are demographically similar, they might be desert countries or densely populated. And all of that we think has given people a clearer line of sight on what best practices might look like from those that are similar to them. And, we do think that this is how a lot of countries are now using the index. We certainly hear back every year from environment ministries who are making comparisons, using it just as we wish they would, as a way to identify their own strengths, their own weaknesses, to understand by looking at the leaders what best practices look like, and then seeking to implement some of those best practices. So from my point of view, that's the essential value in terms of delivering a sustainability agenda and a strategy at the government level for how to proceed towards a more sustainable future.
Great, thanks, Dan. We also have a question about our greenhouse gases and how we measure those. So I want to share just briefly a figure from the 2020 report, where we're looking at worldwide what's happening with greenhouse gas emissions, and this is in CO2 equivalents. And over the past 20 years, there are lots of ways you can try to denominate this. You could say, what is it per capita? What is it per unit of GDP? What is it per unit of energy? And you're going to get some different stories based on how you do that. I think the thing that the climate scientists are telling us is that the world does not care about your intensity. It doesn't care about the per capita emissions. What the world cares about is that the atmosphere and the oceans are filling up with these greenhouse gases. And so this, I think, is not meant to say that it is wrong to look at per capita emissions or to look at as how intense it is or how efficient it is, but it's saying it's very complicated. We have a lot of these raw data about emissions or about deaths and disease from environmental threats, or what is the land area covered by forests. How do we turn these into meaningful metrics? And again, there's no one right way. For the 2020 report, we did look at not just your raw emissions, but your growth rates. So over time, what is happening? Because we want this trajectory to go down. That's what the scientists are telling us. It has to go down to 0. We do have one small indicator that looks at greenhouse gas emissions per capita. That's in CO2 equivalents. And this is trying to acknowledge in some way that there are some countries that are still in energy poverty. And we want to be responsive to that. Not every country is emitting in such a way that if they really reduce their greenhouse gases, that would solve the problem. This is a shared global concern with different people contributing in different amounts. So I'm afraid I can't wrap this up in a super satisfying, neat bow for you. But I do want to highlight that this is complicated, and we're doing our best to take the science and the metrics that we have, the raw data, and turning them into indicators that are more comprehensible. And like I said, it's the start of the conversation. We aren't the final word on this, but we want countries to think more carefully about what success would look like, not only within their borders, but more broadly, according to what the world would want. I'd welcome any kind of feedback others might have on this, or again, suggestions for how we can do this better. Let's see. So without, I think, providing a fully satisfactory answer to that question, we'll move on. Right, so we have a question here about India's 168th rank. India has barely changed over the past 10 years. If we applied our current methods to India's performance 10 years ago, there's been no improvement, and it is quite low down on our list. It's 168 out of 180. There are lots of things that are helping to drive this. But we would encourage people who want to know why do particular countries score the way they did. Go to the individual country profile that you could find on our website. You could probably pull up India's fairly quickly and drop it into the chat. But you'd see that we not only have the top line score, but every subsequent score for each country, as well as a 3-page PDF that summarizes all of the information we have, the indicators, and how countries have been doing over time. And this would be able to let you drill down further and to say, what is going on here? Where are they scoring the lowest, and where are they excelling? Where do we see that over the past decade, there may have been a trend in the wrong direction? And this is meant, of course, for not only government ministries to understand how they're being measured on a global scale, but for a variety of stakeholders to use this as an opportunity to hold policymakers accountable for what's happening within the countries. And we would, on that note, caution you that this is not meant to be a stick with which to beat whatever government is in power. India's lagging behind, especially in air quality, which we know is emerging as an enormous threat globally to human health. And that is a result of policy decisions that have been made over decades that cannot be laid at the feet of any one government. So even though we encourage within robust democracies there to be a struggle over delivering on the governance of how the environment is doing, we would not say that we're endorsing any one party or government over another. And this ties back to a previous question about the weights. Since globally air quality is such an enormous risk to human health, it gets the most weight in our environmental health policy objective. So Tanya, feel free to jump in if you have anything to elaborate on some of these more focused questions on the EPI. Right, how do we compare the rankings of sustainability goals in each country? Is this EPI used for knowledge, knowing the status of each country and where they're lagging? We do try to be directly responsive to the SDGs, although the SDG indicators are developed with different criteria than we have, and that'll probably be addressed in the next panel. But we definitely do intend for the EPI to be used by various stakeholders within countries to understand the status of the outcomes and where they're lagging. So the lag, you could say, is either happening over time or again with your relevant peer group. So we encourage you to look at who you think your peer group is, not only to think about how you're doing, but also to see what kind of lessons can be learned from people in similar circumstances, similar geographies, similar levels of economic development, similar threats that you might be facing, and strategies you could use for advancing. We really shy away from proposing any one goal or policy or tool that you might use, because we realize that that's not stuff that, that's not the kind of advice we can give that's totally data driven. And if, to the extent that it is, it's local knowledge, things that our audience knows much more about than we do. So out of humility and caution, we would say the application of the API can take many forms. And again, we're always happy to help people understand what the API does, but we're not going to give you specific policy advice. Let's see, more questions. Conflict. Conflict is a big issue in the API. For 2020, we did not provide scores for Syria, for Yemen, or for Libya. Countries experiencing conflict, perhaps it's not surprising, it's hard to get good data coming out of them when state capacity is very low, and perhaps even skewing the environmental, health threats. It could be due to environmental reasons, but also for reasons unrelated to the environment. But I think you don't need the API to know that the war is generally a bad thing and counterproductive to sustainability. It's lamentable, and we hope that in the future we're able to develop scores for every country, regardless of the past history of the conflict and of course, a speedy resolution of ongoing conflicts.
There was also a question on the carbon credit market to see if the EPI is affected by, let's say, one country buying carbon offsets through projects in other countries.
That's a really great question. And that is, I think, something that we would have to think hard about, incorporating that into future versions of the index. We don't currently. We know that there are ways that countries affect each other. Like I said earlier, we're very interested in spillover effects of environmental impacts embodied in trade or goods and services. But we also recognize that combating climate change is going to require resource sharing and investments by more developed countries into projects in less developed countries, not only through directly investing in infrastructure, but also these offset projects. I think a lot of those take the form of land use control, and that's something where the metrics that we're relying upon are still in development. So that is a great and important enterprising new field that we should be exploring. It's going to take a lot of thought, I think, and a lot of exploration of the current metrics to really understand how offsets could be incorporated and whether they're even kind of meaningfully different to how countries are actually performing. I mean, if we could, some things, even if we could measure them with full precision and accuracy, it's less clear, to what extent that can make a meaningful difference in how countries are actually scoring in the API. So that's a great question. It's very provocative. And if you have any information you'd love to send us for us to explore and think about it a little bit more, we'd really welcome that. So I see that we're coming up against our break time. Thank you all for being patient and visiting with us. We'll take a 10-minute break and be back with our second panel. Please, if you have further questions, feel free to email me at epi@yale.edu. I'd be happy to continue a conversation offline. But until then, I'll see you all in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Zach.
We are all ready for round two. I want to give a special thanks again to Professor Tanya Srabotnik for lending some deeper insights into the background of the EPI as well as sustainability indicators. It's good to have a kind of a backup where somebody who has much deeper institutional knowledge is able to give you that greater insights and context for the kinds of information and questions we're trying to answer here. We'll give a couple minutes for our next panelists to get back to the microphone. And also for some of our attendees who may have stepped away. All right. Morning, John.
How are you doing, Zach?
All right, great. And Guillaume, thank you. All right, so we'll begin with our second panel, where we're going to look more directly at the Sustainable Development Goals, metrics in practice, to see how the efforts that started 20 years ago or 30 years ago towards bringing more sustainability indicators to bear on the environment and sustainability in general came to fruition and are now being pushed forward with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we'll begin with a presentation by Guillaume Lafortune, who is a senior economist at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where he's the coordinator of the production of the annual Sustainable Development Report, which tracks the performance of all UN member states on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed by the global community in 2015. So Guillaume, with that, I'll go ahead and hand the microphone over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Zach, Dan, also, and to the organizers of this event. I'm very happy to be here today. Let me share my screens. I have prepared a few slides for today. I hope that you can all see them right now. So as it was mentioned, my name is Guillaume Lafortune. I coordinate the work at the SDSN on data and statistics, including our flagship report, which is the Sustainable Development Report, which includes an SDG index and a dashboard. And so I think the session today is on metrics in practice. So I'm going to share a little bit of details about our methodology, our results, but also try to show how we've been using these data, these dashboards to inform policies and support policies, but also when it comes to sustainable investment decisions as well. So we've been doing these reports since 2015. We started at a global level, and as everyone knows, there are these 17 SDGs that were adopted in 2015, so we partnered with the Bertelsmann Stiftung Foundation to create an overall assessment of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so those are the reports that you see here on the top row. These are the global editions. So we've been doing this since 2015. Our latest edition in 2020 was published last June. And then we've also started to do regional editions. And the reason for that is that at the global level, we are constrained in terms of the availability of data that we can use. And sometimes always there is more data available when we go at the regional level. So if I take the example of the European Union, there's much more data available from the European Commission, the teams, whether it's at Eurostat or the Joint Research Center. The same in Latin America, where we can use data from ECLAC and other regional institutions, or the IDB, for instance. So it's also a way to contextualize some of the issues and the narrative sections of the report, so that we focus really on the most relevant issues and indicators for those regions. And then we do subnational editions. And I think this point was raised in the previous session about, how do we also apply some of these frameworks and indicators at the subnational level. And so we've been working with a number of countries to make subnational assessments, including for the US, Spain, Italy, European cities, and Bolivia as well. And we're working with many other governments right now. So on the methodology, I don't want to spend too much time here. As I said, I want to focus a bit more on how it's being used, but just to say that the methodology has been published in the peer-reviewed literature. It's been statistically audited by the European Commission Joint Research Center in 2019. And we have a very detailed methodology paper that was released in 2018, which shows plenty of sensitivity tests, but also more statistical analysis like principal component analysis and other statistical tests that we've performed on our data. So this is all available online. Our data sets are also very much available online. What we're trying to achieve with this report is mainly two things. One is to have a tool for accountability and action on the SDGs, right? So to establish the SDGs as an operational tool for policy action. And then to support also national debates on where the priorities should be and how to implement SDG strategies. The second objective of these efforts, and I think the point made by Zach in the previous session is a very good one, which is that those reports are also a way to push the community when it comes to mapping data gaps and identifying priorities for the statistical community as well. And so we use in our report a mix of official and non-official statistics. When I say official statistics, is data coming from UN custodian agencies primarily, so the IMF, UNESCO, ILO, WHO, etc. And when I speak about non-official statistics, it would be data that come from the research, the science, and SDSN is a network of researchers and universities, so we leverage those data, but also from NGOs. We have data from the Tax Justice Network or Oxfam, for instance, that we include in our report. And so the second purpose of the report is also to identify those data gaps. I should say that this report is absolutely not an UN official report. I mean, even though this is sometimes considered as an official UN report, this is not a UN report. It's a report done by a team of independent researchers. That's actually very important to note and to avoid any confusion here. In terms of the method summary, so what we do is to calculate distance to invariant sustainable development targets. So each indicator is normalized on a scale from 0 to 100, and it defines a percentage of how much a country has basically bridged the gap towards achieving predefined targets. There's 85 global indicators in our assessment that are clustered around the 17 SDGs. We use a bit more indicators for OECD countries, about 115. We incorporate new indicators as they become available. So that's something that comes up quite often, is that we get comments about whether results are comparable from one year to another. The reality is that because we changed the basket of indicators and because the SDGs have, and I think this is a positive thing, pushed forward the whole agenda around data and statistics, there's new indicators that become available every year. And so we incorporate them in the methodology, but that means that comparability over time of the tool is not perfect, it's not one for one. The score, the overall index score is an aggregation of all the 17 SDGs, and we put strong emphasis on accessibility and communication. So when we have different choices, we tend to opt, or methodological options, we tend to opt for the option if there's no huge difference between the results that would be obtained. We tend to opt for the simplest one. So that explains, for instance, why we're using the arithmetic mean over the geometric mean, for instance, because we did a sensitivity test and we saw that at the overall SDG index level, there was no major difference, and the arithmetic mean is more easily understandable for the layman audience. So that's really a report and a methodology that we want to be accessible for a wide audience, including layman citizens, but also policymakers. So in terms of the results, this is from last year's edition that shows the progress across regions, but also by income level on the overall SDG index. We've calculated retroactively our scores in the past. And basically, I mean, one of the messages from last year's report is that overall, when we look at what happened over the past 10 years, but also over the past 5 years, there's been some progress on the SDGs, not in every country, and the progress differs across the goals also. But obviously, COVID-19 is a setback for sustainable development, but it should not completely destroy the momentum that was happening and some of the progress that was happening before COVID-19 hit. So we have very detailed dashboards, goal by goal, that present basically a summary of the results and where the strengths and the weaknesses of each countries, but also each regions or income groups are. I'm not going to go into details. All of this is available online, but there is really a lot of information available. And then we also make available online detailed country profile, which allows you on the left page to see summary results for at the goal level primarily, but also the details for each indicator. So any country, any government can take a look at this and identify which indicators is problematic, where are they lagging behind, and what explained their overall scores and performance of on each of those goals. And so in terms of overall impact and reuse, I mean, we've just done a research actually last week, and we saw that we've been cited in more than 20 VNRs, voluntary national reviews, in 2019 and 2020. We also know we've been mentioned and quoted extensively at the high-level political forum and the UN General Assembly, including by Amina Mohamed, who has made statement and who has supported our work in the past 2 HLPFs. We've been covered in a bit more than 170 media and news article. Where obviously it's the flagship of the organization, so it's the most downloaded report of the SDSN. We know it's used by civil society organizations as an accountability tool and to make their governments accountable for achieving the goals. And more surprisingly to me, we also receive a lot of requests by the private sector, including financial institutions, to see how this can be used to inform sustainable investment decision, but also multilateral development banks as well. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to share 3 examples of how we turn this tool, which originally was really meant to be a tool where we take the best data available, we cluster them around the SDGs, we calculate distance to target, and we give a picture, and it's not only static, we also calculate trend over time of the performance of countries. And from this tool, we have started to go beyond that and try to support really efforts to streamline the policies and investment decisions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And one area I think where we have really done a lot of work is on this area of what we call international spillover effects, right? So we include a separate index in our report, which we call spillover index, which is tracking basically actions that a country is generating on another country, right? So typically it's one thing to decarbonize CO2 emissions domestically, but if this is achieved by outsourcing cement and steel to another country and re-importing the production, in an SDG world, which is a global responsibility, this is now no longer tolerable. And we have the econometrics tool now to track those impacts, including through multi-regional input-output table, and attribute parts of the emissions or biodiversity threats or accidents at work to the importing country. So countries are penalized for their domestic action, but also for generating negative impacts through trade. And we see here that rich countries in general are performing very poorly on the international spillover index. And so we have put a number at the country level, but then the next step was to go beyond that and to look at specific supply chains that are unsustainable and support actions to align those supply chains to the SDGs. So we've released a report in November 2019 specifically on the impact of Europe and China through the soy supply chain on deforestation in Brazil and Argentina. And we're also working right now on a study for the EU looking at specifically the social spillover effects that the EU is having in South Asia through the textile supply chain. Then, and that was a question raised in the previous panel, is how about the involvement of the subnational level? Because we know that one data point per country might be hiding a lot of disparities within a country, right? So we see here for the US that the situation is very different, whether we are on both sides of the coast when it comes to the SDGs, or versus we're a little bit more in the middle states here. And the same applies to other countries, Spain, Italy. We've done work with Bolivia. So we've done a lot of work to apply our methodology also at the subnational level, but also to support processes at the subnational level for integrating the SDGs into local policy frameworks. And I think for all these reports that we're mentioning, the output is important, but the process is also very important. right? And so we've been doing lots of workshops with governments, national statistical institutes, civil society organizations, universities, really bringing a lot of stakeholders around the table and discuss, okay, what are the data that are available? What are we missing in terms of data? And how can we go about making these kinds of subnational SDG assessment using a wide range of information available? So here you have an image of a workshop that we did with our Bolivian colleagues, and that was last year. And we've also been working, so from this assessment we've been doing with US cities, we have a whole USA Sustainable Cities initiatives where there's been meeting on how do we come up with long-term SDG-based strategies in a selected number of US cities, including San Jose, California, Baltimore, Maryland, among others. But so just to say that the process in these reports is also very, very, very important, and we gain a lot from those exchanges as well. And then finally, when it comes to investment, we've been working, for instance, and that's one example. I mean, we receive really lots of requests to say, how can we use this to inform, especially sovereign investment decision, a lot from the impact investing community. But we've been working, for instance, with the Inter-American Development Bank to use our gap analysis or distance to target analysis and see how can this be incorporated into the IDB's country strategies, but also into some sort of investment toolkit, which would allow using a taxonomy of sectors and subsectors to identify the investments, the types of investments and the countries which would benefit the most from additional investment. And so here we need to go beyond the data that we have in our SDG index and dashboards and incorporate additional financial information to come up with this kind of ex-ante assessment of the potential of additional SDG investment in specific countries and some specific sectors. To conclude, I mean, one thing I wanted to mention about this is that these are all, I mean, what we're doing with the SDG index and dashboard is to provide outcome data primarily. So the best data that we can find to track countries' performance on the SDGs. Now, we know at the international level that there's usually a time lag of 2 years at best, often 3 years. And so we're doing quite a number of efforts to try to have more real-time assessment of what's happening on the SDGs. And here I'm going to mention two. One is those policy trackers that we're developing. So I think in the previous panel, someone mentioned that the SDGs do not, I mean, are separate, 17 separate goals. There's 169 targets, more than 230 indicators. So that's really a lot. That's very big. So we've tried to simplify this agenda and come up with 6 SDG transformations. And for each of these transformations, what we're trying to do is to track the policies and the efforts that governments are doing. And if I take here the energy decarbonization and sustainable industry, for instance, transformations, we know that the Climate Action Tracker have actually done fantastic work at tracking the nationally determined contribution, what are the targets, what's the level of ambition in there, and then the policy action to come up with an assessment of if we look at country strategies right now, what kind of global warming are we going to have? And so from their assessments, we're able to have a more real-time view of what's happening, not based on data which is 2 years or 3 years old, which might be assessing actually the actions of the previous government or even the government before. So policy trackers and policy analysis is one way we're trying to address this data gap. The second one is that we've launched an SDG Today platform, where we've collected all the data that can be available in real time to track the SDGs. And so this is available now. And so this is also complementing the SDG index and the dashboards by providing real-time estimates of the situation on specific SDG indicators. So it's not as comprehensive as the whole 85 and 115 indicators we have in the SDG index, but for certain key aspects of the SDGs, it does provide a real-time vision of where we are standing. I'm going to stop here, but happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Guillaume. It's great to hear from one of the major managers of the SDG index, a super important composite index out there pushing the SDG indicators and helping people understand how countries are doing. We'll transition now to another great figure within the world of the SDGs, Dr. John MacArthur, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, also a senior advisor to the UN Foundation and a board governor of the International Development Research Center. More directly tying to the SDGs, he's previously managed the UN Millennium Project. He's also served as CEO of the Millennium Promise, and he co-founded the 17 Rooms Initiative for the SDGs and co-chaired the International Commission on Education on Sustainable Development Practice, among many other accomplishments and roles that he's done helping to push the world towards a more sustainable future. So I'll turn it over to John.
Well, thank you so much, Zach, and a pleasure to be with everyone and Guillaume and all included at EPI and UNITAR, our friends Dan Esty and Nikhil Seth and just so many leaders on the line. So delighted to be with you. I think that there are so many ways to think about these challenges, and I think what Guillaume has just described is a really seminal and important effort on that the SDN, my former colleagues leading it, have been really pulling together over a number of years. And if I were to boil it down, we're in an academic environment, so I'll be a little bit academic, but also try to just kind of boil it down. There's so many efforts of how to measure what we're taking on right now. Talk about the EPI, we've got the SDG index that SDSN produces, we have the social progress index, we have the SDG indicators themselves, we have India developing its own SDG index, we have a number of cities developing their own very particular forms of measurement across Canada, we have links to a Vital Voices survey, and we have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We have the World Economic Forum just having put out a major effort on how companies can measure on a couple of dozen starting indicators backed by the world's major accounting firms. So we have many, many efforts. And I think these are very important to understand the diversity of efforts underway, because each is actually tackling, in my view, a slightly different question that's pertinent to the SDGs. And so when we're thinking about these global issues of the SDGs, and the SDGs themselves are, of course, just a tool to tackle the deeper challenges of sustainable development, I think we always have to think about what is each one trying to measure, and then what problem does that help us solve? So if I were to boil it down, very mechanically, I think the SDG, as our colleagues at SDSN and the SDG index have really provided a way to synthesize data across countries in a way that really allows comparability on an absolute scale. That, is a crude, doesn't do justice to the sophistication of what's been done, but we see the rankings, the tables, and so forth. And it allows a way to think like, how's this country doing overall, or this community compared to another, and how do we rank? And I actually think it's most powerful for comparing similar countries. I think when we get into the issues of precise measurement of how's a company doing, or how's a community doing, who's getting left behind, how is a country doing compared to its own starting point? And many of the SDG targets are about relative progress within the country. So many are also about absolute targets by a global scale. So we have to be thinking about all these questions at once. And again, sort of a horses for courses mindset in terms of which type of question and which type of measure will provide us the best type of answer for the problem we're trying to solve. So in that context, I just wanted to share yet another approach that we've taken on, trying to tackle, and my colleagues, and especially my colleague Homi Karas and I at Brookings in the past few years, trying to take on what we might call a by-the-book approach to the SDGs, and really especially motivated by the No One Left Behind agenda. And we've really taken it seriously to think about the SDGs as even the specific development goals. We're about specific people facing specific problems in specific places. And how specific can we get about who is solving which problems, or who is facing which challenges where? And I do that because I think a lot of this needs both a conceptual frame and an ability to think about there are only so many people on the planet. In the end, 7.5 billion people is a big, big world. But if we think about, for example, in my home country of Canada, we might have 99% access to safe drinking water. That might be fantastic on a historical scale. But if the 1% of the population is not getting it, and those are all Indigenous people, then we've got a major structural problem that we can't, in Canada, we would never say, we're doing great because we've got 99%. We would say, how is it that in 2020, we live with a significant, historically marginalized population or set of populations that still don't have access to basic drinking water? And that ability to think about specific people in specific places facing specific problems, where you can actually go looking at a lot of the reserves in Canada, and online you could look today at who doesn't have access to safe drinking water. I think that notion of specificity is a crucial complement to these aggregate comparability questions. So it's in that spirit, I just wanted to share a little bit about how we've approached this, because I would argue that we need an all of the above mindset depending on what we're taking on individually. So if I can work this technology, I'm just going to share a few slides, and hopefully, can you see this? If someone could nod. Great, okay, good. So the first thing is that when you take a by the book approach, and Guillaume mentioned this, there is this question of how many targets can be empirically assessed. A colleague of mine, Krista Rasmussen, we did this, and the OECD's and a couple others have done it. It's in some of the top scientific journals. Everyone's come up with a slightly different answer. I'm biased, I think we have a pretty good one. But we looked at these questions, that if you want to actually use them within a country, these 169 targets, what can they tell us about outcomes? If we took a really by the book approach. First filter is the target outcome focused at the country level? Well, it turns out only about 94 are, or by our count, actually 94. Is the target quantified and measurable? Well, actually only 37 of the 169 really are. If it is not quantified and measurable, can a proxy target be established? Well, we figure in 41 cases, yes. And so out of the 169 targets, again, if one takes a by the book approach of what the targets actually say, only 78 are actually accessible empirically. There's a whole separate question of which ones have data available, and that depends on the context, the country, the community at which one is looking. But that's a starting point of how many of these targets are actually measurable when we consider the SDGs. Then, if I can do this, there's a question of proxy targets, because so much of this comes down to good judgment. And similar to how SDSN is in many ways developed proxy indicators and proxy metrics for an interpretation of what each goal or target might be aiming for, we said, well, how can we develop just a regularized logic so that any community could identify its own proxy target? And really, it's just, and I'll leave these slides with you. It's not to have everyone read every word here, but you have a 2x2 is the target quantified? Does it define a specific outcome level? And is it measurable? And if it is, then just use it as written. Like target 1.1 is pretty clear, eradicate extreme poverty. If it's measurable, but not quantified in its outcome, and for example, target 16.1 says significantly reduce all forms of violence, it's ambiguous what counts as a significant reduction. We've suggested, well, anytime it's about something like that, a significant reduction, let's at least call it reducing the problem by half by 2030. But then if the target's not measurable, then we have a tougher problem. We have to think through, well, what would we use if it's quantified but not measurable? So target 11.7, universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces. Universal access is quantified. That means something for everyone. But it's not necessarily clear what counts as safe, inclusive, and accessible, or green. So one can use a proxy target like a park within 10 minutes, which is actually an indicator that is used in many places. Similar, the hardest problem is if it's not quantified, not measurable, in which case you have to assign a proxy benchmark and a proxy indicator. So we use as an example, target 16.6, develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. Well, in Canada, at least, and I'll get to in a moment why, there's a regular survey that looks at the share of the population with confidence in the justice system and courts. So we said, why not at least reduce the population without confidence by half as a proxy? So I share this just as a logic for going, again, by the book, but in a systematic way for thinking about what do we do with each target? And for everyone's awareness, we do have online in the original source kind of target by target classification on each of these. And the implications actually vary tremendously by SDG. In my experience, different people care very much about different SDGs. And so some people care hugely about oceans. Some people care hugely about climate change. Some people might care hugely about the circular economy and responsible consumption and production. Each of these actually has a different degree of measurability in its natural measurability in its construction, because these are of course politically negotiated. And the green here is the number of targets that are naturally inherently quantified and measurable. And the red is where we thought you could identify pretty good proxy targets and go by the book. Note that in goal 13 on climate, which is so central to the world, this is where countries, of course, are setting their own targets through the NDC process and the COP process, which will be culminating again in Glasgow next year. But this is a question where we don't even have country level targets beyond those the countries set for themselves. We only truly have the global target of 1.5 and 2 degrees. And then if we look at it this way in a very specific by the book manner, if we look at like non-communicable disease, this is a study we did where we said how many people are actually affected by the success or failure of these goals globally. So non-communicable disease, there's a target under goal 3 to cut by 1/3 non-communicable disease mortality. Well, it turns out that the difference between how countries are doing today versus if each country achieved that target is 29.3 million lives. Similarly, for child mortality, it does have an absolute target, or I said not similarly, a similar emphasis on lives, but different absolute standard instead of relative. It's about 9 million children's lives that are at stake. And one can go through by each target how many lives are at stake. Similarly, we can go through how many millions or billions, or in certain cases in smaller communities, thousands of people's basic needs are at stake. And at the top, you know, we have dramatic stories on some indicators like gender equality, sanitation, undernourishment. Then we have at the bottom, depending on how one benchmarks it, you know, things like birth registration in the year 2030, how many will be unregistered. So we can go through, again, specific people in specific places facing specific problems and actually count who confronts what. And then you can actually look underneath. This is a recent analysis of the trajectory. Which countries are really the concentration of the issue? So this is millions of overweight children in our global, you know, healthy food crisis and sustainable food system crisis. You can actually say, well, the top 5 countries in this case are 5 of the most populous countries, and we can start to look exactly where the people live who are going to be confronting these challenges. And, you know, not surprisingly, the US perhaps is among these, as is China, Nigeria, Indonesia. But then when we take this approach by each target, we then try to make it useful for policy. And what do I mean by that? This is the study where we applied this framework for each of these measurable targets, and we looked at the available data. And on this graph, we looked at each measurable target within Canada and which ones had data. And a full circle means that it's quantified and directly measurable. A hollow circle means that we used a proxy measure. And what we did was we said, let's look at each of these targets and really boil it down to, on the right side, what's on track. Acceleration needed might mean that it needs just a little more. It's already on course to go more than halfway, but it needs to go the rest of the way. But for policymakers, it's this moving back and breakthrough needed that we decided was really crucial. Moving backwards, because that indicator is actually going in the wrong direction. And breakthrough needed because it's not even on course to go halfway to the target. And so as I summarize it, if I was a prime minister or a head of government or head of state, on track is where you put your junior ministers, make sure it keeps running. Acceleration needed is where you might put your up-and-comers. Breakthrough needed is where you might put your seasoned ministers who, might be able to bend the curve. And moving backwards is where you have a turnaround situation and you really need to put on there. And this matters to me because many countries, you often hear though, they have to pick their priority. My first question is always, well, how many members are there? In Canada, at last check, there were more than 34, I believe. So each minister just has to worry about half a goal in theory. And then we can think about how we distribute responsibilities around who's watching and responsible for which target. Final point I would add is the business dimension of this, because I think it is perhaps the most interesting, exciting, and the most likely to advance significantly over the next 5 years. We had this Better Business, Better World report out of the Business and Sustainable Development Commission a few years ago, which many CEOs around the world were involved with. And it tried to reframe the SDG conversation around the business opportunity, trillions of dollars of market opportunity for the company that could build the energy efficient building or have the sustainable food system or tackle the healthcare needs. In the current pandemic, we of course see that the healthcare companies that can develop the vaccines or develop the therapeutics will make money, even if it's governments who buy their new product, because there's an opportunity for doing it better. But what we've also seen is that businesses are having real trouble, and this is a bit dated now, a study from 2018, but the fundamentals haven't changed. With the business roundtables, many others, we have roughly 3/4 of companies now mentioning the SDGs in their annual reports. We only have about 1/5, and maybe it's grown a bit, but not too much, of CEO or chair statements mentioning the goals directly. And then really only about 1/4 of companies are disclosing meaningful indicators on targets related to the SDGs. And I would argue this is the big frontier and where many of us have a role to play in contributing. We need better metrics that industry-specific companies can compete on against their industry peers. So Coke, Pepsi, and Tata Tea have to be able to compete on their own industry metrics, quite separate from a digital company or a textile company or an energy company that each need their comparability. So they cannot be good or bad, but better or worse than their competitor. But this is really, I would argue, the links in the chain problem for the next 5 years. We don't just need better metrics. We need shared metrics that not just companies use, but regulators require, financial managers and investors dub essential, and policymakers align around with their incentives, especially on public goods. We see the Carbon Disclosure Project, I would argue, as the tip of the spear on this, with companies needing to disclose their carbon footprints, needing to disclose increasingly their strategies to get to zero emissions by a certain date. But in order for this to have real teeth over time and to be the norm rather than the exception, the investors that might own those companies need to call for the same scorecards and track against them. The regulators need to require annual reportings alongside the financial metrics, the sustainability metrics, and then the policymakers need to put in place the incentives like a price on carbon to make sure the companies have a real reason to do so. So this is where I see us moving on the SDG agenda over the next 10 years. 5 to really get it done, and then 5 hopefully to start implement it. we have many steps forward, including, as I said at the outset, this World Economic Forum report with the big four accounting firms a few weeks ago, issuing the first attempt at a truly consolidated set of industry metrics for the SDGs. But we do have a good ways to go, and I think all of us who are trying to implement research and practice in this area have a huge role to play in trying to figure it out. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, John. That was an interesting deep dive into everything we can do to understand the latest applications of these SDGs. So again, participants can drop some questions into the chat, and we'll be able to open them up to the broader panel here. One question we have addressed to Guillaume, but also I think, John, maybe you can also tackle this, is about Bolivia. Through a current period of instability, maybe hampering their ability to provide data in a timely way, especially in advancement of the SDG indicators. So could you talk more broadly about what you're doing to build state capacity or to help countries, especially national statistic offices?
Sure, yeah, I think I can say a word about Bolivia without entering into the politics here, but also speak more broadly about how we support partner countries in this. So on Bolivia, we were actually surprised about the amount of data we could identify at the subnational level when we were working on this SDG report. It's actually called an atlas, SDG atlas, and it's available online. And as for all of these reports, the way we work is that we have our methodology, which has been audited, which has been peer reviewed, but we work with local partners who know much better the context, the data, the statistics than we do, right? And so they've been able to track actually the performance of more than 100 municipalities in Bolivia, covering pretty much all of the SDGs. I mean, there's some SDGs that are a bit harder to cover at the subnational level. SDG 17 on partnerships can be a little bit harder. Even SDG 14, at times, depending on where cities are located, might not make a lot of sense. We have the same issue at the national level, but usually, and in this Bolivia report, we were able to cover a lot of the data. Obviously, in all of these reports, we also identify some of the data gaps, and there are obviously data gaps in Bolivia, but this is a country where we were actually positively surprised compared with other countries we're working with about the availability of subnational data in Bolivia. And generally speaking, I mean, I think these processes, and when we embark and we support a country in this, is very useful to map out what do we have in terms of data and what are we missing, and how can we set up basically an agenda for improving the availability of data, which will allow us to track those issues over time. So we use a little bit this SDG index as an output where everyone is working on, but also as a process to improve over time the availability of data and statistics. And that's what we're doing right now with countries like Paraguay, but also Uruguay and Latin America and other countries around the world.
All right, great. John, I don't know if you have anything to add to that?
No, I'm not active at all in Bolivia, so I defer to Guillaume.
So our next question is more addressing this idea of businesses in finding solutions. What kind of ways are we addressing the trade-offs we might see between resilience and learning how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
Do you want me to take a crack first? Happy to, Guillaume.
Sure, go ahead. See if you can tackle this.
I think if I understand the question, this notion of how to prepare businesses has got how to tackle resilience from the business perspective has a few angles, I think. And ultimately, I would suggest it boils down to two angles. One is, what do we produce for the world? What's our product or our service as a business, and how does it contribute when people buy that? That's the essence of a business, is we sell something and someone's paying for it, and they're paying for some value. And how is that value consistent with resilience? That can be economic resilience, that can be social resilience, that can be environmental resilience. But I would argue that we need a better way to figure out how much of a problem is that business helping to solve. When we think about something like a pharmaceutical company might actually be able to think about, again, even if a government is the one procuring the medicines it sells, it can think about how many of the people are getting the medicine as a share of how many people need the medicine, and that's the share of the problem they're helping to solve, either in competition with others or on their own. There's a separate set of questions, though, which I think are too often overlooked, not just by businesses, but by all organizations, nonprofits included. And I've raised it with my own, I should say, which is how consistent are we in our behaviors, our norms, our practices with the Sustainable Development Goals? How good are we at implementing some cross-section of these targets that show that we're operating in a way that is economically, socially, and environmentally resilient? Now, many organizations have started to look at things like their energy footprint. And what's our share of energy usage that is renewable, or do we have a path? Many large companies are starting to look at this, a lot of the big tech companies, Google, Microsoft, News Corp, and so forth. But I don't think enough of us are thinking about things like, enough organizations, things like, well, what's our internal policy on gender equality? What are our metrics for showing equal opportunity on gender, by gender? What are our metrics for advancing opportunity among less educated or lower wage workers? A colleague of mine, Marcelo Escobar, is working on this with Otis Raleigh, the Rocket, where they've been saying, if we look at, say, the US labor market, there's a huge trap of companies having no incentive to invest in lower wage workers, and lower wage workers having no incentive to invest in their job. And therefore, we have very high turnover rates and very low mobility among those workers because they never get a chance to augment or transfer their skills. So one of the questions that is now being put forward is, how do we look at and measure across thousands of companies at a time their investments in skill building and capacities of lower wage workers, who, by the way, are, of course, typically people of color and typically people who are facing other forms of marginalization or exclusion or discrimination in the economy and society. So I think this is how we need to be thinking about resilience in a much more systematic way. I think the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Agenda are always helpful in prompting economic, social, and environmental as a starting point. But then we have to be thinking not just about how our outward behavior is delivering towards the share of the problem that needs to get solved, but how our inward operations, and even, as I say, our supply chains, where we buy our paper clips, matters, because we need a lot of entities have large procurement budgets, which is their single greatest source of leverage on what other companies then do too. So I think we need much more 360-degree performance metrics. And this is, again, it's a big agenda, but an exciting agenda, and one which is where I see the world going in the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to exercise some moderator's discretion and try to synthesize some of the questions that are coming in. We have this idea of the SDGs proposing targets that we're trying to hit, indicators that are being tracked by the United Nations as well as by national statistical offices. And then we have the development of other proxies and other indicators that are being produced by researchers around the world. How do we make sure that we're not, we're properly accounting for all these various sources of information indicators, not double counting them, as well as incorporating them into formal frameworks and putting some kind of stamp of approval or making them part of a permanent or ongoing basis of measuring the SDGs. And I think this is something that maybe Guillaume, you can start us off by talking about how the SDGs handle these issues over the course of producing your report?
Absolutely. So I think I'll start with complementary outputs that are generated obviously by UN official processes and what the research and science community could bring to the discussion. So first of all, I think, and I hope John would agree with me on this, is that I think the efforts on data and statistics in the SDGs has started much earlier than during the MDGs. So we see a lot of initiatives around data statistics for the SDGs. I think it's a good thing, but you know, the trade-off of that is that there's obviously a lot happening, and there's a lot, you know, it's not always straightforward what to get in terms of key messages. We just did, for instance, an analysis. We just compared basically our results for European countries between our report, the OECD distance to target report, Eurostat's SDG report, which is done for the EU, and then a report done by a team of Italian statisticians, an organization called ASVIS. And we published this in the literature. It was published in Sustainability. And we just looked basically what explains the key differences between four assessments that are trying in theory to measure pretty much the same thing. The underlying phenomenon that we're all trying to capture are the SDGs, but we come up with rather different results across the four reports. I mean, the OECD reports, for instance, is saying that high-income countries are very close to achieving SDG 12 to 15 related to environment and biodiversity. In our report, these are the goals where EU countries and OECD countries are performing the worst. And I think, I mean, we came up with 3 explanations that explain the difference between our report and reports which have been done by basically government-led institutions like OECD or Eurostat. The first reason that explains those differences is whether you are sticking to official indicators or whether you are incorporated also non-official data to address some of the data gaps, right? So I think, to give an example, on issues related to biodiversity threats, for instance, right now, there's not that much data available internationally from UN agencies that are available for a large amount of country to track some of those impacts, right? But we do have data on trawling fisheries and unsustainable fisheries that come from organizations like Sea Around Us that can help us address some of the data gaps. We also use non-official data to track issues related to spillover effects, so issues that are embodied into unsustainable supply chains, for instance, to attribute part of the responsibilities to importing countries. And so by including those indicators, already you might end up with a different picture. So that's one element that explains the difference between those various reports. The second element is precisely whether you focused on domestic impacts or whether you incorporate those impacts embodied into trade, for instance, like spillover effects, right? So our report is using 12 indicators that are not measuring just domestic impacts, but are actually measuring the impacts that countries have on other countries as well. And here, since our indicators are denominated on a per capita basis, countries like Switzerland, Luxembourg, or Liechtenstein, for instance, that are small countries with very high trade intensity on a per capita basis, per person, generate a lot of impacts abroad. And then the third point is whether you define a target or not on your indicators, right? So some reports have decided to not report a target, and so they're saying SDG 12, there is lots of progress actually happening on SDG 12. But if you don't know, and that's the case for the Eurostat report, if you don't know where you're starting from, and if you don't actually have a target, you don't know if the pace of progress is fast enough to achieve a transformational objective or not. And so in our methodology, we do set targets. I mean, we have a decision tree, and this is also available online, which is, by the way, the same approach that the OECD is using also. Where we start from, if there's a target in the SDGs, that's what we use. If there's no targets, we go to some sort of scientific consensus or expert-based judgment. And otherwise, we basically use a distance to the current top performers around the world. And I think there was a question in the chat of whether we're changing targets from edition to edition. No, when we set the target, we set it at one point in time, and we don't change it year after year. So basically, I mean, and I think this paper is interesting because it just explains and digs a little bit deeper into the differences across those approaches. What we're doing in the SDG Index and Dashboards report is different from what the UN is doing as part of the official process. And the official process of standardizing indicators is absolutely necessary. And all these efforts that are being done are absolutely necessary. But standardizing international statistics when we don't have them can take 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so what we're doing in the SDG Index and Dashboards is to use proxies, information that come from non-official data, to fill those data gaps. And that basically changes the perception or the results when we compare it to other reports. And then a final point, and that's specifically for the indicators SDG 12 to 15 on environment and biodiversity. If we look at the official SDG indicators, a lot of the indicators are policy means indicators. Do you have a convention? Do you have a strategy? Do you have a directive? We tend to focus only on outcomes in our reports: CO2 emissions, biodiversity threats, which to us are better measures to track the actual performance of countries than policy means or policy inputs.
Maybe I'll just add quickly. I think one of the big challenges here is that a number of the core aspects of the SDGs are unsolved still. So the decarbonized economy, and this is, slight philosophical difference, but also it's like a pragmatic versus conceptual approach. So we recently looked at what we call the decoupling challenge. It's kind of a term of art. Many environmental people use it. The need to decouple economic progress from environmental problems. Roughly speaking, carbon emissions historically are a product of economic success, because each new unit of economic progress is cranking out a corresponding unit of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there is a slight decline in many countries, but it's in some places more material, but relative to what it needs to be, which is a pretty much complete decoupling, no country has figured this out yet. So the high income countries, if you look at their level of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP, it's often less than many of the low-income countries who have, it's greater. Many of the low-income countries have much better ratios of greenhouse gas emissions to GDP. Even if their GDP is small, they're just getting more per unit of carbon for all sorts of background reasons. Even the best country in the world, I would argue, is not yet okay, because no economy has yet turned to 100% renewable and 100% decarbonized. And that's where we need to be thinking really around these all of society metrics, because yes, we need to measure at the country level, but for it to be really actionable, we also need to be able to measure it at the level of companies and nonprofits and universities and schools and hospitals, and really any organizing entity in society needs to be measuring how it's doing in contributing or achieving its part of a globally unsolved problem. And so there are many goals that are kind of en route to being solved. Extreme poverty, we have like nowcasting going on day by day, moment by moment. We have pretty good estimates on how many people are in extreme poverty today, and we kind of know what it will look like to solve that problem, even if we're not on full course yet. But the decarbonization problem is the other end of the spectrum. We don't yet know exactly how it's going to look, and we need each, again, entity in society to be figuring out what its part of the solution is going to look like en route to zero emissions.
Okay, I think we have a little bit more time for one last question, and I'm going to really make it a doozy. So this is going to be thorny, but it's meant to be a little bit open-ended in helping to guide people on where to turn next. So for integrated planning approaches, I think this is an unsolvable question, but which is better approach? Is it to be top-down or to bottom-up? And as people think about their approaches towards sustainability, what kind of skill development and active support do you see as being available for local and subnational levels from international institutions such as the UN?
You?
There was a little issue with my sound, so Zach, can I ask you to repeat the question?
Sure. More broadly, as people try to approach sustainability and measuring it, an integrated planning approach is more effective as being top-down or bottom-up. And then also what kind of skill development and active support is available, especially for local and subnational levels from international institutions such as the UN, or maybe even the SDSN.
Sure. Top down, bottom up. Wow, this is a tough one. I think. I mean, it's basically both, of course. I mean, just to say some of the things that we're doing in the SDSN around those issues of long-term, what we call pathways, basically, to achieve some of those objectives. So we've been working with some think tanks and other research institutions on long-term decarbonization pathways. So setting targets into the future and trying basically to model the economy and see, what would be needed in order to achieve those targets in 20, 25 years. And so we've been also, so this is extensively using modeling techniques and working with researchers and research teams in many, many countries. But then the idea, once we have those pathways, is to go and discuss with governments, investors, utility companies, and trying to discuss, okay, that's what we see, that's what we think is needed. How do we all align our approaches in order to achieve that? So we see this kind of bottom up and this contribution from research and science. And again, the SDSN is a group of researchers and scientists as feeding into the contributions of all the other actors and all the other players that John identified in his last slide, whether they are rule makers, policy makers, the businesses, the investors. We're doing similar work on land use. So we have a project called FABLE, where we're also setting targets for sustainable land use. And here, when I'm speaking about sustainable land use, there's three dimensions here. It's obviously land use systems that are able to feed the population. It's also land use systems that address the issues related to biodiversity and deforestation. But also, how can we work on diets and adjust our diets as well? And so we're playing with those three key dimensions, trying to set targets on those three areas and seeing what are the different policy inputs, strategies, regulations that can be put in place. And we try to model that not only at the country level, but also taking into account more kind of global targets that should be achieved, working with teams in most G20 countries, basically. And so this is all available on our website. This is a different project, but I think here, this is really a good, these are good projects to try to put numbers around what needs to happen and then go to the governments, the businesses, the investors, and say, how do we align our strategies based on those pathways and on what's needed? So it's a bottom up, but also obviously a top down approach that needs to happen. But I think it's more those processes, those large scale stakeholder engagement processes that really matter here. On subnational level, there's tons of initiatives that are happening, whether it's the work of the OECD, the C40, group in Europe. There's plenty of subnational organizations that are working also on the SDGs. We also have our own projects related to subnational efforts and data. And I think, what we see is that obviously, I think there's some estimates that show that 70% of the SDGs have some sort of a subnational component to it. So involving cities and regions is obviously an absolute necessity. And we also see sometimes that when, let's say, federal or national governments are not so active or not so supportive on this agenda, the efforts can come also from the subnational level. And so the involvement of subnational entities is absolutely crucial. And that's what we're trying to do also when we do those SDG index dashboards at the subnational level. But there's a lot happening at the subnational level. There's lots of support available from many, many organizations. And obviously, SDSN has its own tool and is happy to support.
Maybe I would just add very quickly, I think that the beauty of so much of what's happened in the past 5 years is that there has been a proliferation of efforts, because we know that the official UN processes are ultimately constrained by the need for consensus, and there's importance in that consensus, and it plays a huge role. It needs to be as strong as possible. But just like in any other aspect of life, we need entrepreneurialism all around the world, like SDSN has been kind of rigorously providing on so many of the issues it's taken on, and many others in parallel. And so we need, in my view, to see what works. We need to see which countries and communities come up with novel approaches that no one's thought of before. Just like I don't want to tell someone how to use the internet in 2025 because I don't know what the apps are going to be. I don't know what the rules are going to be. But we need different people, different entrepreneurs, young people especially, to come up with new ideas. I think on the SDG measurement, we need it too. And on certain types of problems, you need top down. We need a price on carbon globally. It's going to be much harder to tackle decarbonization without an internationally agreed price on carbon. That's basically a fact. However, we need lots of entrepreneurialism bottom up at the level of companies. Think of Tesla, to cities that are developing clever approaches to building codes and grids, to the actual scientists who are coming up with new approaches that are going to create the new technologies to drive the next wave of companies. So I do think it is an all of the above. But again, we have to match horses for courses in terms of which problem. We don't really want a central authority coming up with job strategies for the world, in my view. We want local entrepreneurial forces to generate job strategies and employment strategies around the world. But I do actually want centralized coordination of disease control around the world, because I want to make sure, just like polio is on the course of being eradicated because there's a group of top-level actors around the world chasing it wherever it pops up, the virus. I want us to do the same globally on the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. I would like us to have global coordination that allows local actors to plug in to a concerted effort, because we will not be free of coronavirus anywhere until we're free of it everywhere. And that needs a little bit of top down with a lot of plugging in from the bottom up.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're at a point where we need to wrap up soon. There's certainly a lot to talk about today. Thank you all for your valuable contributions in this panel. As in a way of closing remarks, I think it would be very difficult for me to summarize everything you've been doing and everything, all the terrain we've covered today. And rather than doing that, I think the take-home message that would be important for the people who've joined us today from the United Nations is that you have lots of different things you can tackle with sustainability challenges. And defining your problems, your goals, the things you're trying to accomplish at the global, national, subnational level, all of those have a variety of tools you can use to address them. And those tools are data-driven, whether they're individual indicators, composite indices, dashboards, models. A variety of frameworks exist. And rather than getting overwhelmed by the complexity that we have in front of us, I think that you should be encouraged that there are so many brilliant people here pushing on these frontiers, and that you would be able to engage with them through the links and information we provided today, to search on and explore the variety of resources you can avail yourself of. You can certainly look for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network to be a kind of hub for a lot of these conversations. The EPI for helping you to direct you to the attention the scientific research efforts that are out there pushing on the frontiers of what we know, as well as the broader suite of academic and UN Foundation resources that are helping to empower citizens and local policymakers to tackle the sustainability challenges in front of us. So hopefully this has opened your eyes. We'd love to hear more feedback on how this has helped you, what your lingering questions are, or what you feel the next steps are, and however you feel that you can push forward on the common challenges we all face. And so with that, I'll give any of the other panelists an opportunity if they want to add a closing remark or conclusion. But otherwise,
thanks. Thank you.
Yes, and I'd also like to give a special thank you to Mr. Seth for introductory remarks, as well as for Professor Asti. A very special thanks to Ambassador Suazo for inviting us to organize this event and enabling us to speak with all of you today. Our great panelists, Professor Srabotniak, Mr. Lafuchun, Dr. MacArthur. And I also have to give a special shout out to the people who were working behind the scenes to help this move forward. And that would include my colleague here at Yale, Rebecca McLean-Rudolph, as well as the whole UNITAR team, especially Paleo Alvarez, Patricia Romero, Harris Latif, and Amy Tien Yu Chao, although I know that there are other people involved, and we thank them all for their special help. Ambassador Suazo, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just a few little words. You already did an excellent job moderating and coordinated the event. I know John because he's the UN Foundation and things like that. It's first time to hear for Guilherme and Tanya. And so just my deepest gratitude from UNITAR New York office for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with all the participants. We were committed basically to transmit and to enable this information to a broader audience. It's not the topic, as Mr. Seth was mentioning at the beginning, that is not so well taken into account by policymakers. It appears to be very technical, it appears to be very cumbersome. And sometimes sharing the knowledge and sharing the information is crucial in this period of time. And I agree with John, with the COVID situation has shown the biometrics and statistic and scientific data is the only way we can move forward to find a solution. But that's for every single aspect of our life, for the implementation of the SDGs, for having a better planet, for having curb the carbon print emission, for having better climate change. So this is a crucial part of our daily life. I am very happy that we managed to send this message across the board today with more than 60-something participants. And my commitment, if in any way we can continue to support Epi or John or Tanya, all of you in your work, just share with us your ideas, and if we can put it out, we will be happy to do so. Dan has doing just a remarkable job putting us together. And Rebecca McLean, I have to say a special thanks to her because since she did an internship with UNITAR, she managed to put it to bridge between Yale and the United Nations and UNITAR. So thank you very much to my team, to your team at Yale, and open doors, and happy to continue this collaboration. And thank you for your time, which is the most valuable thing that a human being can give it to another one, is attention and time. And you did that today, and I highly appreciate it. That's from UNITAR New York office, our deepest gratitude. And I hope our participants really enjoy these sessions today.
Wonderful. All right, thank you all for joining us.
Bye from New York.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Suazo. Thank you all.
Pleasure, Tanya. Bye.
Bye.